Hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Podcast. And today, yes, another D4DJ tier list and slash D4DJ podcast, because I guess it's one of those few things I can keep talking about. And today, we are going to do a different kind of tier list. So I've done a character tier list, and I've done not really a tier list, but I've done a discussion on character archetypes with D4DJ characters. And so today is kind of like a weird mix of both those things, where I'm going to do a tier list on the cross-unit relationship events. This is in honor of the Japanese servers of Groovy Mix have just finished their third anniversary event, which the major theme is the cross beat story, where basically all the units are going to work together more, I guess. I think that was highly inspired by, Bushiroad wants to have their units work together more, I guess you could say. And so in the second season of the anime called All Mix, they played quite a bit with that. They did the cross-unit song collaborations. And then now, I guess they're doing that story again in the game. Because, of course, one of the funny things, and I've mentioned this several times, where Groovy Mix and All Mix are kind of two different continuities. And so while the All Mix continuity may have the units work together, now they're going to actually establish that a lot more in the Groovy Mix continuity. And of course, even though in our international servers, we're not going to get this event for a while. We probably won't get the event of the beginning of Crossbeat until probably mid to almost late November. I say mid-November because we're doing there's a certain collab event going on right now at the time of making this podcast. Then we'll probably get the Halloween event, like a week after Halloween. It's kind of funny, but that's just how it is. And then we'll get the third anniversary after that, so it probably will be near the middle of November. But despite that, they came out with 4 new songs for D4DJ, and they were the Verses or Verses, which is a collab again with Mermaid and Rondo. There was Cyberpunk with Abyssmare and Unicord, which I'm definitely looking forward to that, because we're going to get some Neo and Lumina interaction, and that's going to be a grand old time, I'm sure. Then there was 8 Tones with Piki Piki and Photon Maiden, and the other song, which I cannot begin to pronounce that, with Happy Around a Lyrical Lily. Of course, this goes hand in hand with they're leading up to the next D4DJ, and D4DJ is a huge music event for the D4DJ franchise, and so that's going to be happening. The real life event is happening at the end of May, and so the Groovy Mix is kind of doing the in-universe story of this upcoming real life event. And so what better way to celebrate the beginning of Volume 4 of D4DJ Groovy Mix than to evaluate the other cross-unit stories. Of course, here we have what Groovy Mix did, so a little bit of context, was that some of the events that they would do is where they would have what they call a relationship event. And the relationship event is where they focus on 2 characters, and there's a story about the two particular characters. So in the first year and the first half of the second year of Groovy Mix, they kind of just kept the relation stories within units. So the first one was it was Miko and Miyu, so 2 Lyrical Lily, and then you have Aoi and Hiro. And so it was like within this characters within the same unit interacting. But of course, like when you have unit stories, you already have a lot of that. So throughout, after they kind of did like a bunch of stories like that, they had 12 relation event stories. They then decided to mix it up a bit, figuratively and literally, have cross-unit relationship stories where you would have a character from Lyrical Lily and Mermaid and have a story about them. And so those are the stories we're going to be tiering and discussing today. And I mean, it only feels right, since we are going to be moving into Volume 4 XROSS BEAT event, or events, I guess I should say. It's multiple events for our 3rd anniversary of Groovy Mix. So that's the pretext you need before I dive into tiering and discussing quite a bit of the stories. And the way I'm going to go about that is, I'm aware that not a lot of you may be fully, like, quite knowledgeable of D4DJ. I'm aware that, like, I'm a huge fan of this very niche franchise. So as I evaluate each story, I will kind of give a quick rundown of the story. Then I'm going to tier the story, and then we're going to talk about various narrative aspects of the story, and basically me justifying their place in the tier list. Hey, Tom Landry, welcome to the stream. What is D4DJ? Okay, so I know this requires a lot of context, especially for this list, and if you're just here to hear the sound of my voice, that's all great. But if you need to get caught up to speed, I do have 3 other videos of D4DJ content on the channel. Well, technically I have a half one as well, but I didn't include that in the description below, where I have my original character tier list. I have a special Father's Day video I did earlier this year, and I did the trope talk, where I analyzed the 4-girl gang story archetype and then used the D4DJ characters to talk about that trope. And for those of you who may not have all the context, you may want to check out those videos after this, or before if you're watching this as like a post stream, because that will give you a lot of the context, as I will be referencing them quite a bit. I'm just going to assume you have knowledge of the stuff I talked about in those videos. So as you see at the bottom here, you can't see the whole thing, but I do have all of the stories laid out by the character pairs, and I'm going to go through them in order of appearance. So that means the very first one we are going to do, if I could just remember, look at my notes here. We're gonna first, oh, sorry. No, not now. Sorry about that. Of course, the phone has to go off now, right? Of course it does. Of course it does. So the first story we're going to talk about is the Saori and Miyu cross-relation story. It's called the We'll Always Be Together. And another great cameo by the phone. Yeah, because people constantly call the house line, even though they should be aware that people work at this hour. But, I mean, that's relative as well. Because, I mean, it could be like someone in a different time zone. You know, like those numbers from like the East Coast that call over to the West Coast? Those annoying numbers. But anyway, the first one is We'll Always Be Together, and this is the Saori and Miyu cross-unit relation. So Miyu is in Lyrical Lily, and Saori is in Mermaid. I'm going to put this one in the A tier. Which is a pretty wild statement, because one of the things I'm going to just say right away about this story is that this story set the bar really high. And I mentioned this back in the trope talk video, where one of the things that made me change my opinions on like certain characters and which ones I like the most, Saori basically became my favorite character. A huge part of it was because of this story event. So the story event itself, that we'll always be together, it's a story that starts out primarily about Saori, and it's about Saori thinking about the future, because she's like a third-year college student, and she's thinking about, well, what's she gonna do after college, because she realized that basically she's just been like spending the whole time being like part of Mermaid and just partying all the time. And so she's seriously thinking about her future, and so she gets an internship with the nicest meta joke, a company called Mushy Road. And so throughout the story, what happens is Miyu, as she starts seeing Saori less, she starts having this kind of like separation anxiety, where she feels like, well, what's going to happen to us if, you know, Saori moves on and they stop interacting the way that they normally do. So a little bit of background context. And something that was kind of interesting with a lot of these stories, and the way that characters were paired up for these cross-unit relation stories, is that there's an established lore behind how certain characters know each other across units. And so the way that Miyu and Saori know each other is that Saori is actually an employee of Miyu's family. So Miyu's family is like comically rich. So there's like rich girls, there's really rich girls, there's really, really rich girls, and then there's comically rich. And Miyu falls in that category, where she's in like the comically rich. And so Saori is a private tutor as well as a maid for the family. And so obviously that means the two of them interact quite a lot. But of course, if Saori ends up getting a career job, well, that dynamic between them would no longer be the case. And so Miyu kind of has a separation anxiety about this. And so the story ends with the two of them having a nice talk after Miyu's internship at Mushy Road ends. And Miyu basically gives her some life advice about how, well, that's part of life, that people move on, things change. But at the same time, Saori assures Miyu that even when life changes for them, as they grow up, if you will, they'll still be friends. Because I think something that Miyu didn't realize, I guess, is that their relationship is more than tutor-student. But rather, Saori sees Miyu as her friend. And so Miyu's reminded that, like, well, we're friends. And if you want it so, then we can keep being friends, even when our lives change. And so that's the story of we'll always be together. So one of the things that made me really like this story, it's near the top for me, is because of like Saori's growth, and I've mentioned this quite a lot with the Trope Talk podcast. I talk about how like Saori is one of the characters that grows the most in D4DJ, and a lot of it really shows here, where, and the story even goes into this discussion a little bit, where Miyu asks about the kind of person Saori was before they met, and you learn that Saori was quite a loner. Even in her first year of college, she didn't make friends and whatnot. It wasn't until her second year she meets Rika, and then of course that whole story plays out of, you know, the founding of Mermaid and all that. And even when in the earlier stories of the earlier Mermaid stories, Saori's always the nervous one. She's very unsure of herself, and at first I mentioned this a while back, but at first I wasn't the hugest fan of Saori's character because the whole overly pessimistic character and a worry wart. But at the same time, I guess part of why I didn't like that was because it weird thing to like think about for me is that Saori reminds me of me. I think I relate to Saori a lot, which is probably why she's my favorite character now. Saori reminds me of me and how I used to be like when I was that age. And so, but at the same time, the person Saori becomes is the person I wish I was at her age. Where Saori kind of matures quite a bit and she has a lot of wisdom, which she does offer to Miyu at the end of this particular story. About being able to move on and to be content with where you are in your life. Hey Gauntlets, welcome to the stream. And so, how's my day today? It's been good so far. We're just hearing some D4DJ stories. And so, Saori's maturity is what makes me like her so much. And why she's basically my favorite character. I mean, and throughout the more recent stories, because this story occurs before the Nova side story Mermaid chapter, and at that point, that story just like was amazing with how much Saori has changed and her transformation. And Saori basically being my favorite character. So, one thing that made... The problem with this story, fundamentally, is that the story set the bar really high. And of course, as we go through other later stories that we analyze, there's quite a number of stories that don't quite hold up. I mean, there's a lot of good ones. But if I'm putting, like, the very first story in the A tier, like, that's setting the bar really high. And this story was phenomenally good. One thing that is a bit of a weakness to the story is that, I mean, this is, once again, it's also before the Lyrical Lily Nova side story. So, the person Miyu becomes, and I like to think that some of Miyu's character development comes from this story. And how much Miyu herself changes. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword, because when I was rewatching a lot of these stories before today, just to refresh myself on all the stories, and this story reminded me of like, oh yeah, I think one of the things that Bushiroad was getting at when they were writing these stories, especially like the development of Lyrical Lily, was to remind you that Miyu is a child. I mean, she is basically the 7th youngest character. She's only older than the 4 unicorn girls and then Sophia and Elsie. So, Miyu's basically the youngest... Well, for the longest time, she was the youngest character. Well, technically Michiru was. Because Michiru had actually been in the game since launch. But Miyu is basically the youngest character out of, like, the 6 main groups. And so, to remind you of that, Miyu expresses a certain amount of immaturity in this particular story that you don't really see in a lot of other Lyrical Lily stories. But that's because a lot of her immaturity, if you will, or lack of maturity, is deflected by how childish Miko and Kurumi act with their prankster nature. And so it's kind of deflected of how childish even that Miyu is. And the story does explore that a little bit, because the story actually doesn't feature any of the other Lyrical Lily girls. It only has Miyu, and then it has Saori, and then the other characters in D4DJ that are in the story are the mermaid girls, because one of the interesting dynamics is that there's a huge contrast between Saori and the other 3 mermaid members, Rika, Marika, and Dahlia. And I think the contrast of Saori and the other 3 mermaid girls shows this. It shows that, like, yes, Saori is the most developed character in the group. Where she's the one who thinks about the future. She's the one who thinks about growing up, if you will. Whereas like Rika's all about going to Japanese barbecue, and the other girls kind of just go with the flow. So there's that kind of interesting dynamic, and that like maturity of Saori is, I think it's what sells the character for me. It's what makes her the best character, or at least my favorite character. And so I rate this one a solid A tier. But with that said, now we get to like another thing too, is that something I'll do throughout this tier list is that I obviously compare the stories to each other. And so I'll use this story quite a bit as like a reference point as I evaluate other stories, which I know might sound kind of unfair, because I might rate some lower. I mean, let's be real. You're gonna be hard pressed to find a lot of S tiers. Any good tier list doesn't carry like 10 S tier, because an S tier is an S tier then, at that point. But to compare stories with something that sets the bar this high, well, we'll just have to see how that plays out. Alright, so the second story we're going to talk about is The Cute Girl and the Scary Me, which is a story about Kurumi and Noah. I'll put this one in the... This was a tough one. It's alright. It's an alright story. So basically what the story is about, The Cute Girl and the Scary Me. The story begins with Kurumi inviting Noah to her house. And Kurumi wants to mess around with like hypnotism, because high school girls are into that kind of thing. Go watch my Halloween video about how creepy Japanese girls can be. But basically, Kurumi does like a little hypnosis on Noah. And what ends up happening is Noah, what the hypnotism does is it reverses everything of how Noah views cute things. And so Noah's the character who's known for like freaking out over cute things and is obsessed with all things cute. But the hypnosis makes her think that all cute things are scary things. And of course, if you know Japanese, there's obviously a wordplay of kawaii and kawaii. Kawaii. So there's obviously a wordplay there of cute and scary. And so what happens is Noah then freaks out over everything because, you know, she lives in an anime girl world where everything is cute. So everything scares her. And so the Photon Maiden girls, Ibuki, Saki, and Toa, all get concerned with Noah's behavior. And so Kurumi enlists their help to try and have Noah snap out of it. And they basically go to Noah's house and they learn the origins of Noah's fascination with cuteness. And of course, through reminding Noah of her love of cuteness, Noah reawakens herself and she snaps back to her normal freak self of obsessing over everything cute. So this story, I think the story's alright. What the story does well, we should talk about what the story does well. It does a very interesting origin story. We learn a lot about Noah's nature. Because of course, throughout Groovy Mix, Noah's... One of the things that was interesting about Noah when you compare her to D4DJ First Mix, which was the first season of the anime, and then of course Groovy Mix, I made this comment back in my trope talk when I was talking about Peaky Peaky. But it's also true with Photon Maiden, is where in First Mix, the unit is introduced, so Photon Maiden is introduced to the story as part of the contrast to Happy Around and their happy-go-lucky nature. And of course, with Photon Maiden, it's part of their like cool image. But in Groovy Mix, characters are allowed to be themselves, if you will. Just gonna fix this actually for a second. Nope. Chat box. I'm gonna move the chat box actually. I don't know where to put it though. I don't want it, like, it's gonna be in the way of the characters, but I didn't want it in the way of the tier list. Anyway, so, but now you can hardly see the text on screen, but just gotta deal with it. So in first mix, you don't, like, Noah's not a major player in that show, so you don't see her actual, like, nature of her being a girl who freaks out over cute things. You see her more with that whole cool, smart girl kind of persona that she puts up. But of course, when you start playing Groovy Mix, Noah's all about the cute things, and so this story, The Cute Girl and the Scary Me, explores the origin of that. And basically what you learn is that it was basically when Noah met Kurumi when they were young. And Kurumi's like the cutest girl she ever met. What the story also does introduces kind of well is like other parts of Noah's character. And the story is more about Noah, but there is a little bit of the dynamic of the relationship between Noah and Kurumi. Now, one reason I did bump the story down to like C tier is that the story is more lopsided. It's more about one of the characters as opposed to both of them. Comparing it with the We'll Always Be Together with Miyu and Sari, the Miyu Sari story, what that story does really well is that it balances the story between both characters. So in Sari's case, it's about her thinking about the future. But for Miyu, it's about growing up and learning to not be afraid and to be willing to accept that things change. And so there's an interesting balance of how the story focuses on both characters. Whereas in The Cute Girl and the Scary Me, Kurumi doesn't really go through a lot of character development because the story isn't actually really about her. It's more about Noah and the audience learning a lot more about her. And so it's really more of a Noah story, but of course at the same time, Kurumi is a centerpiece to the story because she is the origin of Noah's obsession. Which is an interesting way of, once again, having the units cross more. And, you know, it's not like characters just revolve around their unit. So an example of this would be how Mooney's character in Mooney of Happy Around, there's actually not a lot to her character involving her interacting with characters outside of Happy Around. You could pretty much maintain the integrity of Mooney's character within just Happy Around and how she interacts with Happy Around characters. The other characters are just kind of... Mooney doesn't really need them. You don't really need them to explore Mooney's character. Whereas in the case of Noah and Kurumi, you actually do need Kurumi to explore Noah's character. Which was quite a bit of forethought in the writing of Groovy Mix. But at the same time, I think the story itself it's okay. I wouldn't say it's not like amazing. It's not as good as some of the other stories. So I'm gonna just leave it as C tier, which, if you haven't caught on already, the C tier is kind of like the mid tier. Because, once again, there's like... Out of all these stories, there's only really like one story in this whole batch that I would probably put like, I didn't like its story. But we'll get there when we get there. The next one is the Yuka and Ibuki story. The Yuka Ibuki story. That one is called... What was this one called again? I'm trying to remember what this one was called. The Aiming for the Goal. And so, the third story is Ibuki and Yuka Aiming for the Goal. This story is an interesting one. Because what makes it an interesting story... where am I going to tier it though? I'm gonna put it in the C tier. I might change my mind actually a little bit about this one. Because there are some things in this story that I actually really liked about it. But I don't know if it's worthy of being like a solid B tier. So we'll think about it. I'm going to put it in the C tier for now though. So the premise of the story is basically Ibuki, she meets up with some girls in like the school's track team, and they ask the leader of the school track team. She asks Ibuki for a favor because apparently the Senna is the girl's name. Senna has a foot like an ankle injury, and so she's told she's not supposed to run too much, or else like she could permanently damage her foot. And so she asks Ibuki for a favor, and that is to run with the track team and be like a fill-in, and to help them out because Senna also is ambitious about their school being in the championship of track and field. So Ibuki agrees, and then she also gets Yuka's help because Yuka's like a gym trainer. So to help the track team get better at track and field, you're gonna get a gym trainer to help you out. Makes perfect sense. So basically they do a lot of training, and then the track meet happens, and they do really well in the championship. The Nationals Championship kind of thing. And so this story, what makes this story interesting is that this is probably the most self-contained story. Now what I mean by that is the story is really about the two of them. There are no other like characters from any other unit in this story. So back with the Miyu and Sari story, the other mermaid girls are present in the story. In Kurumi and Noah's story, the other Photon Maiden girls are in the story, as well as Muni and Shinobu. They appear in that story as well. But in the Yuka Ibuki one, it's only really the two of them. Now, one reason why I was tempted to bump it up to B tier is because I think the acting is really good. Part of it was because it was Ami Matamoto, who was the original voice of Ibuki. It was actually her last performance as Ibuki. Because I think what happened was Matamoto, she basically had like a mental breakdown, kind of. She just felt too much pressure in like the entertainment industry, so she like stepped down from acting for. But then she ended up coming back like 8 months later. That's besides the point. But it was her last performance as Ibuki. So that, I mean, a lot of people liked her as Ibuki's actor. And this was her last performance. So there was that factor to put in. And with that said though, since it was only Yuka and Ibuki in the story, they have to carry all the voice acting because all the other characters are not voiced. Because you're not going to give voices to all the potato faces NPCs. So the acting between the two of them had to be really good. It had to carry the story. And I think they did a really good job. I think the acting between them is very good. And of course, Yuka and Ibuki as characters, they do have a lot of history with each other, as they're both gym girls that work out together. And of course, the story behind that is Ibuki, she frequents the gym that Yuka's parents own. And so Yuka was her trainer one day, and then they became fast friends. And so it's tough. The story is kind of like, it's okay. I think the story's fine. But the acting in it was actually really good. I think I don't know if it's a tier worthy though. We may come back to the end and I might change my mind, but I'm going to leave it in C tier for now. But I do admire that the story was very self-contained. And another aspect of it being self-contained is that like you could kind of just fit this in any kind of timeline. You don't have to reference a lot of other events within D4DJ. An example of this problem shows up in the Haruna and Aoi story. I'll put this in C tier as well. Sorry, did I say... Who did I say? Haruna and Aoi. Yeah, that's totally who we're talking about. And this is the story called My Prince. And the premise of the story is Haruna is approached by the drama club of her school to basically perform in the school play. And the school is doing a play on Romeo and Juliet. And so Haruna is handpicked by the drama club to be the Romeo role. Which is a lot to ask for, because, you know, it's the lead role along with Juliet. And so because Haruna is Haruna and she can't say no, she accepts their invitation and she takes the role of Romeo in the play. So she decides to go get some help outside of Lyrical Lily, because she kind of doesn't want the other girls to know that she's doing this drama role for the school, which kind of is weird, because one of the weird ass things about D4DJ's continuity is that the Lyrical Lily girls are basically celebrities in their school. So anything that any of them do would be like everybody would know. At least I feel like that would be the case. But whatever. So Haruna gets assistance from... Well, she ends up stumbling into Aoi of Rondo. And basically Aoi decides to help out Haruna, and they practice lines. And so Aoi would read all the Juliet lines to help Haruna get into character, how to play Romeo. Which is, I guess, is kind of convenient, because there's the whole Haruna's a massive simp for Aoi. And so, as the story develops, the story actually switches, and the story is less about Haruna and more about Aoi. Where we explore a little bit of Aoi's past, that Aoi used to be a very girly girl. Which takes Haruna aback, because Haruna is so used to associating Aoi with the cool demeanor that Aoi gives off. Because Aoi's like a very cool person, and mixed with the androgynous appearance and the very cool and collected personality of Aoi, makes a lot of women attracted to her. Because she's basically like, she's all the things that girls like in a guy, but then at the same time, if you ask women what they want in a guy, usually they end up describing another woman, and Aoi is basically that character. Aoi is the personification of that idea. And so, even though Aoi gives off this impression of being like the perfect guy in a lot of ways, Aoi herself views herself as being feminine. But of course, she's kind of abandoned that image because she's just so used to being the cool, collected type that she is, which is why everybody loves her. And so, the story explores Aoi's desire to be more feminine, and it gives that, like, Naoto from Persona 4 vibes, where she acts kind of masculine, but she desires to be very feminine, but I guess she's developed this image of being like a tough guy that you no longer see that. And Haruna makes that mistake. Tsubaki ends up kind of giving Haruna a bit of a lesson and thinking about, like, well, you only know Aoi on like a superficial level. You don't know the real Aoi. But Haruna starts to learn a bit more about Aoi's personality and her desire to be kind of girly. And it kind of breaks down that perfectionist image that Haruna has over Aoi. And so that's kind of the character growth in that story. And of course the story itself ends with the girl who's supposed to play Juliet in the school play ends up getting a cold. And so she can't perform on the day of the performance. The Rondo girls are going to watch the play, and then Aoi goes and checks up on Haruna, and it turns out that there's a crisis. And then they're like, what do we do? Do we like cancel the show because our Juliet is sick? But then Haruna comes up with the idea of like, well, Aoi knows all the lines, which it's one of those funny things where like technically that kind of violates. I don't know if that violates like school rules of like just picking up a college student to perform in a high school play, but anime logic be anime logic. And so Aoi performs the Juliet role, and it's kind of funny when you think about like the character designs. And I didn't talk about this much with the other character cards, but one of the funny things about Aoi and the Juliet outfit is that like it shows. I mean, part of it is to like accentuate the feminine nature of Aoi, because of course, one of the things that D4DJ plays around quite a bit is that Aoi covers it a lot of her feminine features with her androgynous persona. But then like the funny thing is that like she actually has a very feminine physique. And so part of it is like she's got the bust on her, which is funny because you don't think that when you first look at her. And it ends up working out well because like she's voiced by Seonko. So that ends up being, that's kind of funny on a meta level. And then the Juliet outfit, it like shows quite a bit of skin and like, you know, cleavage shot on Aoi, which you never would see otherwise. Because Aoi never has like shots like that. But of course I think I have a theory about that and why like the Juliet outfit is a lot more sexualized compared to what you would expect from like a Catholic girls' school play. And I think it's because the outfit itself is actually too small for Aoi. And so Aoi's figure is accentuated by the tightness of the outfit. That's my theory behind it. But in the episode, you kind of see that like Aoi can look very, very feminine. And of course, one of the funny things about it too is that like there's that whole shipping with Aoi and Tsubaki, but when they show you the picture of Aoi when she was younger, in her high school days, you notice that Aoi and Tsubaki actually have like a very similar phenotype. So it's just kind of funny that it turns out that way. That Tsubaki has a crush on another girl who basically looks like her. So I don't know, I just thought that was kind of funny. Though, of course, there's that whole, like... Also, she has, like, the hair extensions. Because Aoi's hair is normally kind of short. And there's that whole little bit about how Aoi had considered growing her hair back out. But she doesn't have the heart in her to do it because she's too used to keeping up that cool demeanor that she always upholds. Another funny note about this story is how... If you remember my trope talk, and I remember talking about like Haruna being the hot one of Lyrical Lily, and one of the reasons for that is because her proper demeanor, you know, being a proper lady, it attracts other girls to her. So Aoi and Haruna have that in common, is that the way they act attracts other women to them. And so there's like the part where like the drama club girls are all like talking about how great Haruna is, and they're basically simping over her the same way she simps over Aoi, and it's kind of funny. And there's quite a number of moments where it's just like Haruna's like a massive simp. But despite this, I think the story itself, it's okay. I don't know if I put it in the good story category, because there's quite a number of, like, really good stories. But if I were to bump up either of these two into the B tier, because I'm considering putting one of them into the B tier, it would be this one. I think this one's a little bit better. As a story, like, in general. But I remember reading, like, comments to the story, and a lot of people actually downvoted this story. Because they weren't a fan of the whole, like, Haruna being a minor aspect to their, like, because, like, obviously they flirt quite a bit with, like, Haruna. There's a lot of, like, weird shipping, because, you know, all-girl cast, girl on girl action inevitability. And it's weird to ship like Haruna and Aoi because, you know, Haruna's a minor. So, and Aoi isn't. But if you ignore that factor, I think the story itself is pretty good. It holds up. I was tempted to keep it in C tier, and the reason for that is because one of the fundamental problems of this story is, since the story, they never really explored much of like Aoi and her, you know, her more feminine side. They haven't really explored that in any story since this one. And this story came out in the Japanese service. It was definitely before the new year. So this is like a 2022 story. I think by the time it hit international service, it was after the new year. I think. I don't quite remember. But it was a while ago. Basically a year from now, anyway. And that's a long time ago. And so since that, we haven't had any story that really explores Aoi and her desire to be more feminine. Now, of course, now they've, in the current round of relation story events, they went back to characters within a unit interacting with each other. So the first one, since they finished the cross-unit relation events, the first one was Hiro and Tsubaki, so both Rondo. The next one that the Japanese servers just started, and the English servers won't get it till like probably the end of November, is a Piki one with Shinobu and Yuka. And so I think they're going back to that route, and I highly doubt that when Aoi and Nagisa have their eventual relation story, I don't think they'll really explore this part of Aoi's character. It just doesn't make sense for them to do it. So I don't know, who knows when the next time they'll actually explore Aoi's more feminine side. There was a little bit, but not much of it, in the Rondo side story, but that was more about learning about Aoi's true family history, and less about like Aoi herself. I mean, it is about Aoi in the sense that she comes to terms with her past, but you don't explore this particular aspect of Aoi's character and her desire to be feminine. You know, that Naoto Persona 4 parallel. And who knows when that's going to come back. I would like to see more of it, but who knows how long that's going to be. So that's the only downside to this story, really. And that's why I was tempted to put it in C tier, but I don't think I can hold that hypothetical against the story like as a whole. So, My Prince goes in the B tier. Now, the funny one is the next story. It's called It's My Style. Not to get confused with Make My Style, which is the song by Happy Around. It's My Style is the Marika and Toa story. And I'm going to put this one in the B tier. Not so much of the story itself, but because of my bias towards Toa. And I mentioned this in my tier list, but one reason why I really like Toa is because Toa is one of those characters who she'll say and do things that have made me like laugh out loud. And not a lot of characters do that. Like, consistently. Like, every character's probably had a moment I've probably, like, laughed. Like, actually laughed. But Toa's done it a number of times, and so that's why I put Toa, like, very high on my tier list. Toa is a character I like quite a lot because of that. And so this story has quite a few of those moments. And so I think that's why I'm going to put this on B tier. So the It's My Style story is about how Marika and Toa, they're hired to act in a movie. And basically what happens is, eventually it turns out that Marika doesn't like the project because she doesn't like the director. And the director is kind of a creepy asshole, so there's that. And so eventually Toa kind of gives life lessons, which is kind of funny that Toa being the younger one gives life lessons to the older character. And on the other hand, it's like also giving like in real life, it's kind of bad advice, where like Toa's advice to Marika is basically do what, follow your heart and do what you feel is right, which is not always the best. It's actually bad advice in general, but in anime world, it ends up working out. And so Marika ends up quitting the project, and then the director ends up getting arrested for drunk driving. But then like social media reveals that the guy's like a total creep, because throughout the story, the guy's like, the director, he basically tries to like get into Marika's pants, because he's like a total creep. And so one thing that the story does, what makes the story interesting, is one, it addresses like the whole Me Too movement kind of thing in a very clever way. And it also does a few things that's very interesting for D4DJ's writing. So one of the things that, if you read through D4DJ stories, since the main cast is all female, most of the time when they introduce like new side characters, your extra NPCs that you need for the story, usually they'll be female. So an example of this, even within the relation stories, without going too far to like earlier stories outside of these events, for instance, when Saori starts working at Mushi Road, her supervisor is female. And the thing is that like you look at like the character chat the chat boxes, it'll say like just manager. And so manager being a gender neutral word, but then it's assumed that the character is female. Another case of this is like, well, in a lot of stories, because the Lyrical Lily girls go to an all-girls school. So anytime they interact with another student or a teacher at the school, you assume it's female. This is also true for Yoba Academy, where Piki, Happy Around, and Photon Maiden all attend. It's also an all-girls school. So all the other students they talk to, you assume they're all female. Anytime that a male character is introduced, the the chat box immediately tells you that it's a male character. So two instances of this I can think of off the top of my head is when Saori meets Dahlia's older brother. Before it's revealed that he's Dahlia's older brother, the text box says like shy man or something like that. And so it's like shy man because he's kind of shy, as the text box would tell you. And so he doesn't really speak, and he feels like awkward. And then Saori's like, who is this that's with Dahlia? Maybe like, Saori makes the awful assumption that Dahlia has a boyfriend, but then you find out it's Dahlia's older brother, and he's kind of really shy. Another instance of this is when we meet Maho's dad. And so the Happy Around girls are hanging around together, and then Maho's dad is introduced, and it says like older man. And so the text box immediately tells you that they're talking to a man, and it's revealed that it's Maho's dad. And then but then when you get to the It's My Style story, the story begins with this director. And I remember when I first read this story, the word director is used, and it's not explicit that it's a guy until there are very clear moments where like, he's trying to get into Marika's pants, which means it's a guy. I mean, sure, there could be lesbian creeps, but that's besides the point. But basically, as like it becomes obvious he's trying to get in Marika's pants, it's pretty obvious he's a guy. But of course, throughout the throughout the dialogue itself, his gender is not actually like flat out revealed until basically much later in the story, where he's straight up like being super creepy. And then what's interesting about this story is that there's another man in the story, and his gender is ambiguous as well. But then of course, Occam's razor makes sense that this second character is also a man. And so in the first chapter of the story, which is like the immediate red flags, what happens is Marika and Toa, they're kind of hanging out. The director's talking to them all nice, and he's being all like, "Oh, you know, I saw you. I watched your DFes performance, and I was just like enamored by you." And then like one of the cameramen show up, and he asks a question, and then the director like chews the shit out of him, and he's like, "Yo, you're like, what the hell are you doing? Can you not see I'm talking to Marika? Like, don't talk to me right now." And he's like really mean to him, and the cameraman's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And the cameraman just like screws off, basically, because he doesn't want to anger his boss, right? So before like you get like when I first saw that scene, you could easily have interpreted that it was two women talking, because remember, most characters are not voiced. And so because the director isn't voiced, you don't immediately know that it's a man. And so this story did something interesting by keeping that ambiguity, but at the same time, when I rewatched the story, it's like, oh yeah, duh, the director's a guy. But what made it work the first time I read the story, and it was kind of more ambiguous, was before the director goes all creepy mode, and he's talking about how like, oh, you know, I was enamored by you, watching your DFes performance. You don't immediately get that the guy's just straight up being creepy from the get-go. It's not till, once again, I kind of started cluing in when the director was mean to the other camera person. And so what made that point kind of interesting, and life lessons to all the women, an important life lesson you could learn from this story is, if you want to know a lot about a man, you don't watch him on how he treats women. You learn a lot about a man by how he treats other men. Because you could make the argument that, well, a lot of guys put up performances when they're around women, you know, to flirt with them and try and get into their pants, like this director in Marika. Case in point. So you could make the case of like, well, you can already know a lot about a man when he puts up the performance. But on the flip side of that, that's why it's all more important to watch how men interact with other men, because they don't do that. They don't feel the need to put up that performance. So in the It's My Style story, when the director's being like an asshole to the cameraman, that is like a clear signifier that he's not a good guy, because he's a guy treating another guy really, really badly. And so just a little bit of life lessons there from an older, experienced guy, I guess. Now, as for why I put this in at least B tier, was Toa has so many funny moments. So the moment that just made me burst out laughing is, I think it's like in the fifth part of the story. So basically all these, a little bit of context. Most of these mini stories in D4DJ, they have like 7 chapters to them. And so when you get to the 5th chapter, or was it the 4th chapter? Maybe 4th. I think it's the 4th chapter actually. All the girls are at a Chinese restaurant because there's like a staff party, and the director's just straight up being like super creepy about like how he's like talking to Marika, and he's like, hey, you know, like I'm into interior design, you know, you should let me see your room. And at that point you're just like, whoa, buddy, whoa. And he's basically like trying to like talk her into letting him sleep with her, basically, is what he's trying to do. And then Marika's like, he gets too aggressive, where like he puts without her consent, puts his hand over her shoulder, you know, is getting too close to her. And then Toa comes up with this on the spur moment of how to get Marika out of the situation. And so she like announces to the other staff, like, yo, who wants to watch me eat this spicy mapo tofu in one go? And then the other people are like, yeah, do it, right? And I just found that so funny. It's especially the way that Toa says it, because she's, she's hilarious. And so, when I just saw that, like, who wants to watch me down this mapo tofu? I just thought that was so funny. And then, of course, there's a part where after okay, so I gotta give a bit of context for this. So the fifth chapter of the story is Marika and Toa. They're having a conversation because after Toa ate the mapo tofu and burns herself, because trying to down a spicy mapo tofu in one go is not a good idea. Marika's like taking care of her outside of the restaurant, and Toa kind of like gives her some advice on like do what you feel is right, because of course Marika's unsure of herself, whether she wants to pursue really being an actress, if she has to deal with like creepy guys like their director. And Toa gives her the advice of, well, do what you feel is right. So in chapter 6, what happens is Marika storms back into the restaurant and she just tells to the director's face, like, I hate you, you're a terrible person, and so on. And then the director is just like, it was your fault, wasn't it? And he like lashes out at Toa. So basically this just shows how much of an asshole he is, right? That he lashes out at basically a child. I mean, technically Toa is 18, but that's besides the point. He lashes out at a child. And then Toa is like, oh, playing like, what did I do? I don't know what you're talking about. And so Toa's just being like, I don't remember saying anything. And her like ignorance to the situation is just kind of like comical. Moments like that were just so funny to me. So I find that Toa just being hilarious is why I bumped it up to B tier. Because Toa's just that funny. The only other character... What's interesting about this story as well is that this one was mostly self-contained. Except that like there's a little bit at the end where Toa and Noah have a conversation at the very end. And Noah's like, oh, Toa, I just like read some news about like that movie you were working on. It got canceled, huh? And I heard the director was like pretty awful, misbehaving with women. Which begs the question, like, why didn't Noah do her homework a lot earlier? Isn't she like a total nerd who keeps tabs on everything? And then Noah's like, are you okay? Like, did he do anything to you? And then Toa's like super ambiguous. Like, she doesn't really say anything. And then it just makes Noah like overly concerned. Which, that seems almost hypocritical because Noah's like a total freak herself. The scene would have made a bit more sense if it was Ibuki. But I think Ibuki would have been a bit too serious. But Toa just being like, I'm not telling. Kind of makes like a weird ending to the story. Another cute aspect of this story, and why Toa's like easily an A tier, is that what's kind of what they kind of I think what they're kind of pitched with Toa's character is that even though Toa's kind of an idiot, she has very almost maternal instincts. She is viewed as like a big sister character to like Marika, and then in recent events with Nagisa. And so what's kind of interesting about that is like Noah being like a big sister figure, if you will, to older girls. Because even though Toa's kind of an idiot, there's just something about it that she can still be mature at times, and that mostly comes through her protective nature. And I think what's interesting too is that I think Toa is one of the few characters in D4DJ who's an older sister herself. And I remember talking about this in my tier list a little bit. But, excuse me. I think the only characters that are like older sisters. Well, technically Nagisa has a younger sibling, but Nagisa herself is like a younger sibling to like 2 older siblings or something. And so that's why Nagisa still acts kind of childish. She's a younger sibling. But Toa is one of 3 characters, I think, that has like a younger sibling. The other 2 being Haruna has 1 younger sister, and Maho has 2 younger siblings. Which you do get to see Maho's younger siblings in both first mix and all mix. And then Toa has a younger brother. And so Toa has that big sister in her normally. And so that she kind of just transferred that skill as she like talks to older girls. Which is funny with like Nagisa and Marika's case, is that both of them have older sisters already. Marika has an older sister who's an actress, and so she's no, or is she a model? I can't remember. I think. Oh, see now, I remember Ray's older sister is an actress. I'm not totally sure if Marika's older sister is also an actress or is she a model, because part of the there's a little bit of history where Marika and Ray kind of know. Well, Marika knows Ray because Marika knows Ray's older sister. It's kind of like a weird complex thing like that. I know I'm sidetracking a bit here, but basically Marika and Nagisa being younger sisters, even though they're still older than Toa, they still act like younger siblings, because I guess that they'll always be younger siblings, if that makes sense. Whereas Toa will always be an older sibling, and so that kind of big sister energy comes out of Toa. And that's definitely true in this case as well. So just an interesting note about this story. The next story we're going to talk about is the Maho and Saki story. And the story is called, I'm trying to remember what it's called, Reach for the Light. So the Reach for the Light story is an interesting one. I'm going to put this one in A tier. I like this one quite a bit. And yeah, there's obviously some bias here where like, when you put 2 S tier girls in a story together like this, you know it's going to be good. It's going to be good. And so, I think the story is actually really good. But of course, I mean, I am open to like people's opinions of maybe it's not an A tier, it might just be a B tier, because I am hyping up Saki and Maho quite a bit because they're 2 of the best characters in D4DJ. So a story with the both of them together has to be good, and I found the story to be quite good. And the main reason I like this story quite a bit was because it actually addresses a major issue with Maho's character. And I've talked about this probably in all 3 videos so far. Not so much with the Father's Day one, but I definitely talked about this with the original character tier list, as well as the trope talk. And to rehash, basically, one of the things about Maho's character is that when Maho was first introduced into D4DJ, the writers really wanted you to like her. So Maho always had her best foot forward, if you will. And that meant that you only get to see really likable characters about Maho. So part of it is that, you know, she's very level-headed. Mine is when she sometimes is a bit of an airhead. But she's very level-headed, she's very compassionate, she's kind. She's got all the domestic skills. And she's high, basically all these point to her being like highly competent. And so one of the issues with some of those airheaded moments that I had, where like in episode 6 of First Mix, for instance, it's the first time you really see it. There's a part where Maho's like bathing at Ray's house, and she forgets why they're even at Ray's house, that they're supposed to be studying, and she forgets about it until like she just suddenly remembers. other than a few, like, sure, Maho had airheaded moments like that throughout Groovy Mix. I felt that a lot of it was kind of forced. And I felt like it was forced because they really used that airheaded nature of Maho only really to kind of counterbalance Maho's high competency. Because you can't have a character be good at everything. Otherwise, I mean, that's not a fun character to write if they're just good at everything. But the problem with Maho's kind of airheaded moments here and there is that I feel like a lot of it was kind of artificial and it was clearly forced. But what this story does, the Reach for the Light, is that it actually brings up a real character flaw with Maho. And yeah, First Mix had a little bit of it, but it wasn't well explored and it didn't feel justified enough. And that character flaw is that Maho actually has an inferiority complex, which is, quite the ironic twist, because throughout a lot of the story, Maho is shown to be highly competent. But, armchair psychologist here. But that is something that a lot of people with inferiority complexes tend to that's a certain behavior they tend to exhibit, is that they'll be highly competent to compensate for their inferiority complex. But what makes this story interesting is the way that they bring about and introducing Maho's inferiority. So the story begins with Maho and the Happy Around girls are hanging out, and there's something at Yoba Academy that's frequently referenced in the story called the Remicon. And Remicon is basically like the school does contests of like people remixing music and then they submit it. And it's kind of like a contest of who can make good music remixes. And so the story begins with basically we, the audience, are told that Maho frequently enters this contest. And she scores pretty well. She tends to get like, top 5. She tends to be like 5th and 4th place consistently. And the story begins with like, okay, this time I'm going to make it to like 3rd, 2nd place maybe. I can get closer to Shinobu, who Shinobu supposedly always wins 1st place because she's that good. But then what happens is DJ Dragon hits 2nd place. Now, for those of you who know, DJ Dragon is Saki's persona when she tried making a remix. The first time this happens is in First Mix, episode 10. Or was it episode 11? Sorry, it's slipping my mind. No, episode 11. And it's the Photon Maiden episode, where it talks about after... So, a little bit of context. Episode 11 of First Mix was after Happy Around beat Photon Maiden to get to the Sunset Stage, because only 8 groups could go there. And so there was a contest between Happy Around and Photon Maiden. And Happy Around won. So Photon Maiden was kind of like, what do we do now? We lost to an amateur group. We're supposed to be professionals. And so Saki gets the idea of like trying out the Remicon contest. But she doesn't place because like it's her first time. She's an amateur at it. But then she overhears that Maho actually liked her remix without them knowing who the other is. And then eventually Saki gets caught by Maho for like stalking basically. And Maho then teaches Saki how to do a remix. So that's the context. Fast forward to Reach for the Light. And Saki, after not being around for a while apparently, Saki jumps to 2nd place, essentially beating out Maho, because Maho gets 4th place again. And then Maho feels bad. She starts like, what? How did this happen? How did Saki just reappear and hit 2nd place? And so Maho starts feeling this inferiority complex to Saki. Because of course, what happens is Saki does something that Saki doesn't feel is that bad, but subconsciously Maho is bothered by it. And what happens is after Saki wins second place or gets second place and Maho's still in fourth, Saki wants to get advice from Maho on how to make a better remix so that she could finally beat out Shinobu in the remix contest. But Maho feeling like, that's the equivalent of like kicking somebody while they're down. And it feels kind of, it's pointed out to Saki later, like it feels kind of mean when you ask someone that you beat out in a contest for help. It feels kind of mean. And so Maho feels this massive inferiority complex to Saki. Especially after like Saki asks Maho for help. And Maho just feels like she's kind of like bothered by Saki's presence. Because Maho's dealing with the fact that she does have an inferiority complex. Later in the story, what happens is Maho goes to like a club to kind of refresh her mind, and she sees a DJ named Kanade, and Maho's kind of inspired by Kanade of like how skilled of a DJ Kanade is. And then when Maho approaches Kanade, Saki is there as well, because what you learn is that Kanade was the woman who introduced Saki to DJing. And I mentioned this in my Father's Day video, but before Saki became a DJ, Saki wanted to be an astronomer, like her dad. But Saki meets Kanade, and Saki's like enamored with DJing, and so Kanade shows her the ropes. Kind of takes her on as like an apprentice for a short while. For like just shy of a year, basically. And then what Kanade points out is that, well, Saki is wrong in asking Maho for help, because as I mentioned before, that feels kind of mean. To beat out someone in a contest and then ask them for help after you beat them. It feels really mean. And so Saki's like all embarrassed about this, and Maho's like, you don't have to be so blunt about it. And one of the things that made the story like hilarious to me is just how like Kanade is savage. I guess it's part of the whole like adult women just don't give a damn about how teenagers feel. And Kanade is straight up like, well, you have to spell it out for Saki because she's like obtuse. And I'm like, damn, just calling her obtuse? That's just so mean. Like Saki just getting booted around a little bit. But Kanade points out that like Saki, it's one of those things that like, what's interesting about the writing in this story is that the kind of stuff Kanade says, you would not get away with it in like North America. Because basically what Kanade is doing is telling a girl with autism to quickly, like, to just learn to be more socially aware. Which is not something that would go over very well if you tried that here. Like, if I went up to a person I knew that I knew had autism and I told them, stop being socially awkward. Learn to just be better at socializing with people. You know how much shit I'd get in if I said that to someone? But that's basically what Kanade tells Saki, is like, you should learn to you should shape up a bit. And then basically Kanade plays this little prank on them, and she pretends to like pass out from drinking too much. And so Saki and Maho do the most counterintuitive thing and take a drunk person home to Saki's house. And then the advice that Kanade gave to them before she passes out drunk was, why don't Maho teach Saki how to do a remix again? Even though that seemed like contradictory advice. But what the story kind of gets at is that Maho and Saki are two different people. That Maho is about the theory of DJing, But Saki, the way she does music is very intuitive. She goes with how she feels. But as any musician would tell you, great music is a mix of both those things. You take the theory of how music works, but you also need to add your flair to it. You need to add your style to make it more than what your theory could do alone. That's kind of the lesson that's being taught here to both Maho and Saki. And so the two of them work together to make a song. And then they basically like fall asleep because they work too hard. And then you get to the next school day, and there's another Remicom, and they announce the results of like that week's Remicom contest. And what happens is it's revealed that Maho and Saki brought in a song together, and it wins first place, knocking Shinobu out of her like first place streak. That's the word I'm thinking of. And then Maho and Saki are like surprised. They're like, I don't remember submitting the song we worked on together to like this contest. And then of course, what's revealed is that Kanade woke up while the other girls were sleeping, and she submitted the song. And it's kind of like a little funny ending, and the chapter itself is called the Dream Team because Maho and Saki are the Dream Team. Let's be real, that's like a nice meta move. It's like, yeah, Saki and Maho would be the Dream Team, but the problem is they're both DJs. But I mean, Saki could just be a singer as well because she's also the vocalist of Photon Maiden as well. But yeah, a story that that breaks the fourth wall. Because one of the funny things about Maho's character is that there's a lot of fourth wall breaks in regard to Maho's character. Whether it's characters within the story break the fourth wall with Maho, or Bushiroad themselves make like a meta joke and it breaks the fourth wall, and Maho's always like the center of that kind of controversy, if you will. And so another fourth wall break is like they're referred to as the Dream Team, and of course they would be the Dream Team. Two S-tier girls, Maho and Saki. A story with the two of them is just, it's gotta be good, and this one was pretty good. Of course, some people may somewhat disagree because there's the weird epilogue that when you have Saki's character card, and I didn't talk about these with a lot of the other stories, but obviously outside of the event story, the character cards also have like short mini stories. And of course, like the Maho one was like, a lot of people hated that one because it was like sexualizing minors. So, I mean, that's already, like, sketchy territory. But the epilogue story is that Saki goes all creeper mode and just, like, constantly stalks Maho. It's like, what else could I learn from just watching Maho? But then Maho's got, like, her spider sense going, like, what the, is someone watching me? But the story overall, I think, is really good. I like this one a lot. The humor is the weird part about the humor in this story is that it's all the humor is done with Kanade, who unfortunately isn't voiced. So you just have to read the humor and hope that you pick it up. The acting between them is fine. But I do like the character dynamic of Saki and Maho. And I might as well talk about it now, because at this point, even though we're only like... How many stories? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6... Yeah, so we're only halfway through the cross-relation stories, which is rough, because I'm an hour and a half in. So I gotta speed this up a bit. But we're only halfway through the cross-unit relation stories, and we already had all the stories with the Photon Maiden girls. And I made this criticism in my tier list, but part of this made me think that the Photon Maiden girls, a lot of their stories, I felt like theirs were the most thought out. when Bushiroad was making these like cross-unit relation stories. I feel the Photon Maiden ones had the most thought put into them. One, because they're one of the only groups they're the only group I think that has a relation with like a character from a different unit. There's no overlap. So Saki and Maho, so that's Photon Maiden Happy Around. Toa and Marika, so that's whoops. You have Photon Maiden and Mermaid, and then you have Photon Maiden and Peaky Peaky, and then you have Photon Maiden and Lyrical Lily. So they had the most diversity with their cross-unit relation stories, and I feel like a lot more thought was also put into it because it allowed, well, okay, minus the Yuka Ibuki one, it allows for more storytelling in the future, like potential in the future for storytelling. So this really comes out in the case of like these two stories, which is why I probably rated them a little higher subconsciously, is that the Maho Saki dynamic is a very interesting one. There's so much more they could do with this dynamic, and them being like music rivals. And they have something that like the Miyu Sari story can't do. So let me explain. The way that a theme that's explored in the Reach for the Light story is that Kanade gives Maho a bit of advice on using her jealousy of Saki well, okay, I guess I gotta explain this a little bit. So the jealousy that Maho has over Saki is a contrast between Maho's commitment to hard work. So Maho works hard to improve her DJing skill, but Saki is a person that exhibits raw talent. So Saki grows at a fast rate. This goes back to the whole like theory of DJing versus intuition of DJing. And so Maho's jealousy is stemmed from Saki's natural talent. But Kanade gives advice to Maho saying, use that as motivation to improve. You can use your jealousy as like a springboard to make yourself better. You know, the whole Vegeta and Goku rivalry, basically. That's kind of what Maho is told as advice from Kanade. And so, with that being planted in the character, it allows for maybe future stories that involve Maho and Saki more, and them actually being like music rivals. See, the Sari Miyu story doesn't really allow that. There isn't really much else you could explore with the Miyu Sari dynamic. They're just two friends that will keep being friends. And sure, you can write little cute stories here and there, but you can't really explore that idea more, if that makes sense. But I feel like this one has a lot of potential. And then same with like Toa and Marika, which they have already kind of done this a little bit, where the potential of the Toa Marika story was really more about Toa and the potential Toa has as a mentor character and someone who can be a big sister to other characters. And as I mentioned before, they've kind of already done this with Toa's relationship with Nagisa. And so the Photon Maiden girls, they get there's more out of their stories. Of course, the Ibuki one not as much, but what the Ibuki story does allow is it allows for tight writing with how well like the story itself was self-contained. And it just I liked the Ibuki story because of the skill that was required to write the story. So I was tempted to bump it back up for that reason, but I'll leave that one in C tier. But the Photon Maiden stories, I don't know, I felt like they were very well fleshed out. Alright, I gotta get a move on here, because we're already at 4:30, and I still got 6 stories to talk about. And I realize how much trouble I'm in, because I'm talking about the Tsubaki Rika story. The mutual feelings conveys emotion. I'm gonna just say this now. Best story. Not only is it the best relation story, it's up there as one of the best stories that Bushiroad has written for this game. It's that good. I really like this story. So a little bit of a preface, and I've mentioned this in my trope video, but I have this theory. And that theory is that the Mermaid group was meant to be kind of the main unit focused on, at least for quite a bit of the earlier years of Groovy Mix. I felt like they were like the main unit of Groovy Mix. And part of why I think that was because a lot of the earlier events revolved around, they were mostly Mermaid events. And part of that was mainly because they wanted to explore the other 3 units, like Mermaid, Rondo, and Lyrical Lily in Groovy Mix. Because of course Happy Around, Peaky Peaky, and Photon Maiden, they did have First Mix introduce them. And I mean, First Mix was a Happy Around origin story, so you didn't have to focus so much on them in the earlier days of Groovy Mix. But Mermaid was a unit you had to introduce a lot of their character. And so I felt like Mermaid was like the main group of Groovy Mix, at least in the earlier years. And Rondo has, of course, at the same time, you have to introduce Rondo. And so what Groovy Mix ended up doing was there was a lot of crossover between Mermaid and Rondo, which just, like, Bushiroad, and clearly they knew this worked, because there's so much crossover between Mermaid and Rondo. Not only did Groovy Mix do it a whole bunch of times with stories up to this day even, but first the anime did Double Mix, which was a story about Rondo and Mermaid doing a collaboration together. And then of course, in honor of XROSS BEAT that we're going to be entering into for us international D4DJ fans, and the Japanese servers have already done this event just now, when they mix and matched the music, the units to make like 4 new songs to start off the new volume. Mermaid and Rondo again, in probably the best song, Verses or Verses. I've been listening to that track so much lately. When it came out last week, I was just in love with that song. It, out of the 4 new songs they released, so the first one they released was actually the Abyssmare Unicorn one, which I'm looking forward to that play out, because that means more Lumina and Neo interaction, and that's going to be amazing. Cyberpunk was the first one, and it was alright. Verses or Verses came out, and I know some people may disagree, but I think that's the best song out of the 4 they released. Verses or Verses, and then there was 8 Tones with Peaky Peaky and Photon Maiden, which that one's going to be interesting, because that will continue the story that kind of erupted out of the Photon Maiden and Peaky Peaky Side Nova stories from the last volume, where there's kind of a now interesting rivalry between those 2 units. And they're, seeing each other as competitors. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in Groovy Mix. And then there was the other song with like Happy Around and Lyrical Lily. But see, what's interesting is that in All Mix, which is a different continuity, it was Photon Maiden and Lyrical Lily doing a collaboration, and then Happy Around and Peaky Peaky, because you kind of have to do that story. But every time they did the cross units, it was always Mermaid and Rondo. Mermaid and Rondo. Mermaid and Rondo. It just works so well together. And, I mean, even there's a little bit of that fourth wall break in Double Mix. It's not really a fourth wall break. It's more like a meta statement, if you will, where there is this deeper connection between those two units of Mermaid and Rondo. And at the apex of this, as far as like Groovy Mix and All Mix is concerned, at the forefront of this connection between Rondo and Mermaid, it's Tsubaki and Rika. Now that's a lot of backstory. Now we got to go into more backstory. So part of that, like being at the forefront, is Rika and Tsubaki. And in a way, the two of them are like the main characters of Groovy Mix in a lot of ways. I mentioned in my trope talk that like Tsubaki's the character who grows. She's the character who grows the most in all of Groovy Mix. And it's all because of this dynamic that she has with Rika. But see, in a lot of the older stories, it's always, the dynamic was always the same. It's Tsubaki being unsure of herself, you know, her being the quiet introvert, her being awkward, her being pessimistic, kind of similar to Saori in a lot of those ways. But then it's Rika who shows up. Rika's like, hey, best buddy, let's hang out, let's do cool stuff together, and whatever. And Rika draws out more positive characteristics out of Tsubaki. And so the story always kind of played, the past stories always kind of played out this way. But then we get to mutual feelings conveys emotion. And this story does something really cool, where it actually reverses the roles. And you're probably wondering, well, how the heck would you pull that off? Which is just a testament to good writing in this story. Now we get to the story itself. So what the story is actually about is Valentine's Day is coming around, and as you know, Japanese girl culture, it's time for girls to give chocolates. It's Valentine's Day. And so Tsubaki's thinking about what to do. Well, you know, Valentine's, I don't really do Valentine's. I don't know. But it's coming around, and it's something that girls do. Rika barges in, and she's like, yo, we gotta do like, we gotta have like fondue. We're gonna have a grand old time, make chocolate together, and cool stuff like that. And Rika's like, well, I'll think about it, right? But then, of course, Tsubaki says, I'll think about it. And then Tsubaki, during all this, she's like, you know what, I gotta go for a physical examination. I think my health is kind of bad because I eat too much like 7-Eleven food. Because Tsubaki's like a terrible cook. So she always like buys convenience store food. And so Tsubaki goes to like a clinical checkup, and she finds out her health is, you know, she could be doing better, and the doctors are like, you got to take better care of yourself. And while Tsubaki's at the hospital, she sees Rika's at the hospital as well. And after doing what you should never do, stalking, Tsubaki learns that Rika has an older brother. And so she eavesdrops for a little bit, but then Tsubaki feels a little guilty of like stalking Rika, and then she leaves. So she actually doesn't get the full picture, because what we, the audience, learn is that Rika visits her brother from time to time, who's basically, well, I'll get more into that later. Rika, so basically what you learn is that Rika she visits her brother from time to time, and she would tell him all the stuff that she's been up to, you know, all her time as mermaid and hanging out with the mermaid girls and all that. And Rika always like keeps her brother up to date and always talks to him. And after she catches up with him, he tells her that, hey Rika, I got something important to tell you. But then of course we don't learn what it is right away. The next day happens, and Rika visits Tsubaki, and you know, Rika's being her usual self, like, hey, you know, like, I got this sick plan for Valentine's Day. We're gonna do like fondue, and we're gonna invite your mom, and we're gonna have like a grand old time. You know, the two of us, best buddies. And then Tsubaki's like, I'm not in the mood, Rika. Like, leave me alone. Which is normally how their interactions usually start. But unlike past events where Rika just persists until Tsubaki caves in, and then those stories usually end with, like, you know, Tsubaki's grateful that Rika is forceful at times, because it allows Tsubaki to break out of her shell. But this time the story turns out very different. When Tsubaki starts putting out resistance, Rika gets really sad and then she leaves. And then Tsubaki's like, well, that's different. That doesn't happen. Normally, like, Rika's a lot more aggressive. I don't know what's up with that. And then Tsubaki's like, maybe I'll find Rika later and I'll see what's wrong, because this ain't normal. So Tsubaki goes for a physical examination again, because she has to make sure she's not just eating convenience store food all the time. And then she sees Rika at the hospital, and Rika she's very sad. Like, she's almost ready to cry. And then Tsubaki catches her and she's like, Rika, you know, what's going on with you? And Rika at first tries to play it cool, like, oh, it's nothing. And then Tsubaki's like, BS, you're in a hospital and you're crying. That tells me enough. Like, something is clearly wrong. And so we get a huge part of Rika's backstory. And what you learn is that Rika's older brother, who she visits in the hospital, we learn that this has been something that's been happening for years, because apparently her brother is, like, chronically sick. He basically has, like, a very weak constitution, so he's probably, like, sick all the time, and he's not physically strong. He has to be like, closely watched. And so what you learn is that this has been happening for years, ever since, like, the older brother was in middle school. So rough estimate, we don't actually know how much older he is than Rika, but it's implied that he's at least 3 years older. So let's just put in a 3 year. We don't actually know, but we'll say 3 years. So if he's in middle school, let's say, like, her older brother started being sick when he was 14. That means Rika at oldest would be, like, 11 when this started happening. So that's, like, to translate that into current year, basically Rika goes in and out of the hospital for her brother in a course of 10 years. So this is a very long time. And then Rika breaks the news that apparently he has to go for surgery. And this scares her, because Rika thinks, well, what if something goes wrong? What if he doesn't make it? And so Rika is extremely concerned. And then Tsubaki tells Rika, have you been holding this burden all by yourself all these years? You know, you go out of your way to help people, and you go out of your way to care for others and show compassion for them. Let other people do it for you. And so Tsubaki's like, let me be a shoulder for you to cry on. Let me be here for you. Let me comfort you. Because all these years we've been friends, quote unquote, because they didn't see each other for, like, years as high school students, because they went to different schools apparently. But basically, throughout all their, you know, the past Rondo Mermaid events, Tsubaki would point out that, like, you've always been there for me. You've always been there to be my friend when I needed someone. Let me do that for you for a change. And so Rika learns that to open up more about her real self. And so the story ends with the mermaid girls all visiting Rika's brother, because apparently the surgery goes just fine, and then the brother even makes fun of Rika, because remember, Rika's kind of a meathead. Just like Rinku. I mean, it's a fat girl thing. But Rika kind of overblew the whole situation. The surgery wasn't, like, a serious thing. It's not like it was life-threatening, but Rika made it a bigger deal than it was supposed to be. But with the success of his surgery, Rika and the mermaid girls all visit Rika's older brother. He's not named, by the way. And Rika never calls him by name. She just calls him Oni-chan, or Big Brother. Because that's just kind of something you do. And so... the story... What we learn is that the reason why... Well, one, we the audience. And two, even a lot of the characters in universe didn't know for the longest time that Rika has an older brother. Is because he himself told Rika to not talk about him. And the reason why he made Rika promise to not talk about him to her friends was because he didn't want people to feel sorry for her. He didn't want people to feel sorry about the fact that that Rika's life is kind of pulled down by his crappy physical condition. His crappy health conditions, basically. And he didn't want people to feel sorry for Rika. But at the same time, what you learn is that Rika she looks up to her brother quite a lot. And I talked about this a lot in the Father's Day video, which is funny because he's not her dad. But he's someone that clearly loves Rika and really cares about her well-being more than his own. And so part of the whole, like, he's the one that inspires her to, like, have enough fun for the both of us. And that's kind of the explanation of, like, Rika's over-the-top, outgoing personality. Is because she's always about having so much fun so that she can make up for his medical condition, kind of thing. That's kind of the weird psyche she has. Because clearly Rika has a brocon. Clearly. And so we kind of learned that quite a bit in the story, and the story does have like a little funny twist ending where like Rika's like, I made chocolate for you, make sure you eat mine first, and then and then like the mermaid girls all give him chocolate, and the brother's like, wow, this is like the most awesome thing ever. Getting a bunch of chocolate from girls, that's awesome. And then they even point out that there's like a bunch of Rika's other friends, quote unquote, but remember, you never meet these people because it's just a bunch of NPCs. But there's a bunch of other girls all lined up outside his room to give him chocolate. So yeah, he's like a Giga Chad. At least he must have totally looked like a Giga Chad in the hospital when you have all these like hot girls lined up outside of your hospital room. Like that's S tier right there. So, the story was just so good, and definitely like to see how much Tsubaki has come along as a character, and of course the interesting twist of the role reversal of Tsubaki and Rika. Because another thing too that's really neat about the role reversal is that we actually get to see Rika act more vulnerable. Of course, this comes up again in the Nova side story, where that story was given to us a little bit later. But in the Nova side story, where Rika like messes up big, and then Rika feels all bad about it, so we do get to see a little bit of a vulnerable side to her there. But then of course Saori picks up like the mega cool girl role for a minute, and Saori's like, no, we've already come this far. Why would we give up here? We're mermaid, kind of thing. The identity of mermaid, if you will. But with this story, Rika and Tsubaki, and we get to see a lot more vulnerable sides to Rika, which we don't see often. And I think seeing that side of her adds a lot of dimension to her character. And so, I really like this story. I think it's one of the best stories. Not just within the cross-relation stories, but in almost all of Groovy Mix. I think this story really is a cut above the rest. It's just that good. I may come back to this one. I do want to speed things up a little bit. But there's so much more I can say about this story and how good it is. I really like this story. It's really good. The next one we have is the Kyoko Rinku. And oh my gosh, the title of the story translates to What is Love? Okay. I'll be real with you. The premise of the story actually kind of sucks. However, the acting in it is good. And the presentation of the way the story... It's one of those, like... Think of, like... what's the actor's name? Why is it slipping my mind? Benedict Cumberbatch. Yeah, so when Benedict Cumberbatch did Sherlock. And a lot of people didn't like the Sherlock show because it ended up not being about Sherlock Holmes solving mysteries. It's just Sherlock Holmes being an asshole to people, honestly. And him being like, I'm smarter than everyone else, without actually, like, solving mysteries. And that's why a lot of people didn't like that Sherlock show. But at the same time, you can't hate Benedict Cumberbatch because he managed to make the character work. Like, his acting salvaged how bad the show was, assuming you could consider it being salvage. But it's one of those, like, you admire Benedict Cumberbatch's acting skill, considering how bad of a script he was given. It's this story, What is Love? It's one of those scenarios where the characters, and by extension the actors, they had to work with a really crappy premise, but you have to admire the acting and the presentation despite the crappy premise. So I think the presentation is good, but the story itself is kind of a crappy premise. So the premise of the story is it's not even about these two, which is another reason why it's downplayed. But it's about actually Noah coming out with like a school play presentation thing. She wants to do like a unit, a little show at the school, and the theme of the show is love story, telling a love story kind of thing. And so she handpicks, because Noah's a total freak, she handpicks Rinku and Kyoko. Because Noah's like thinking in her crazy brain, galaxy brain moment, where it's like, you know what? I think a show about love would just work so well with Rinku and Kyoko. Oh, that's a great idea, Noah. I'm a genius. This is kind of what the story is really about. And so she ropes the two of them into agreeing to do this presentation. But then, of course, the problem is you're dealing with two meatheads here. Rinku is, meathead personified, and Kyoko is clearly not the brightest girl in the room. So basically you have two meatheads trying to figure out what love is. So that's the premise of the story. And so I feel like that already is like, you're not off to a good start. And so basically how the story plays out is that the girl, Kyoko and Rinku, they ask people for like help on trying to define what love is. Like the two of them can't seem to figure it out on their own, which just reminds you how stupid both of them are. Because remember, the whole thing about like the reason why on a meta level the pairing of Rinku and Kyoko works is because they're basically the same in the fact that they're more about their charisma. I mean, of course, Aimi, who's the voice of Kyoko, is like S-tier singing, but Kyoko herself is kind of a crappy character. So, because, I mean, What is Love is an exemplifier of that point. Like, Kyoko's kind of an idiot. How does she, like, Kyoko tries to play off like this cool demeanor, but how could she try and pretend to be cool considering how little she knows? That's kind of the weird, like, contrast in the story, which kind of doesn't work. It doesn't work very well. You can't have Kyoko try and act cool if she's actually kind of stupid. like, we all, like, okay, with Rinku, they don't even try to remotely play it otherwise. Rinku is the dumb one of the group, and it's played off as part of the joke. But with Kyoko, when it shows her, like, her lack of knowledge of things, it's kind of off-putting, because it just doesn't, I don't know, it just doesn't work. It doesn't feel right to write Kyoko this way. I mean, I guess part of, like, it explains why Kyoko is kind of a bully, because, I mean, a lot of bullies do kind of, they bully to compensate for the fact that they're not as smart as a lot of their peers. So in order to feel better about themselves, they put down those that are smarter than them. And so, that could explain part of Kyoko's bullying nature. Because Kyoko is basically a bully. In a lot of her other stories, she's a lot more bully. Here, you don't see it. Although, the character card of... The Rinku character card actually draws out again that, like, Kyoko is kind of a bully. Where Kyoko is kind of demeaning when, like, Rinku's acting like a lion. Like, she's trying to, like, act like a cat, basically. And Kyoko's like, what the hell are you doing? Like, you look stupid doing that. Don't do that. And so, it makes you beg the question of, like, why does Rinku look up to Kyoko when Kyoko is so mean to her? But yeah, it kind of exposes that part of Kyoko that, like, this is why she's a bully, because she's an idiot, essentially. But I don't know. I felt like if I was to go into that territory, I feel like Kyoko gets a little bit fridged because of that. And that's where the premise just doesn't work for me here. And that's why I think the story's actually kind of, like, the story itself is kind of bad because of that. Of course, I can't hate Ayumi's voice acting. It's so good. And of course, like, another part of the story that is kind of cute is when Kyoko asks Tsubaki for help. Trying to figure out what love is, but then, like, Aoi's all awkward. Because, you know, if Rika's not around to help her out, Tsubaki's super awkward. Because Tsubaki's thinking about Aoi as she's trying to give an answer. But she doesn't want to flat out say that, like, I'm in love with Aoi, right? She's trying not to flat out say it. But when like, Tsubaki kind of tries to give an answer, and it's kind of, you know, you kind of see that cute and quirky aspect of Aoi. Why do I keep saying Aoi? Of Tsubaki. And it just reminds you, like, Tsubaki's such a great character. And she's so cute and quirky. But then, like, once again, it doesn't really do much for Kyoko. And then, okay, the presentation is nice. I will admit that. Where you get to play a song at the end of their story. Because they, you know, Volume 3 of D4DJ wanted to do something cool. And you get to play songs in the story. And the two singers, Aimi and, I'm trying to remember Rinku's last name. Yuka. They actually do a duet together called White Macaroon. And that song is super good. I can't bump this down to a D tier just because White Macaroon is such a good song. And of course, like, the end... Okay, so there's also, like, a B plot in this story that is kind of really cute. Which actually, like, that's what, honestly, the B plot is what salvages this story. And prevents it from being a D tier. So most of the other duo stories don't have a B plot. So if you're wondering what I mean, is like, okay, you think of, like, any, like, Saturday morning cartoon where you have an A plot, which is, like, the central theme of what is happening in that episode. And then usually there's, like, a sub-story being told. Usually to, like, either one, develop side characters, or two, try to fit a larger narrative into, like, the series kind of thing. So an example of a B plot would be like, okay, so in Justice League, the Justice League cartoon, the build-up, there's a huge build-up in the starting from the second season of Justice League. It starts with the Justice Lords episode, and then it kind of turns into a B plot of the birth of Cadmus, which is a government agency that tries to create a countermeasure against the Justice League and superhumans in general. And so throughout Justice League, the last part of the second season, as well as the first season of Justice League Unlimited, there's a B plot of the birth of Cadmus, and Cadmus actually growing to a point that they could challenge the Justice League. And so but then of course, like, the A plot is what, like, the episode itself is about, and the B plot builds up to the larger story of Cadmus. So that's my explanation of A plot, B plot dichotomy. So the What Is Love story, it utilizes a B plot, and the B plot basically is, while these two boneheads are trying to figure out what love is, they both have another girl. They both have, like, other girls, if you will, that are in love with them. So in Rinku's case, Mooney is in love with Rinku, and Shinobu is in love with Kyoko, which I have no idea why that's the case, because Shinobu is, like, the biggest victim of Kyoko's bullying. I don't know what Shinobu sees in Kyoko. I mean, it's because both of them are charismatic, and that's supposed to be attractive enough, but a little bit of life advice. Do not try and build your romantic relationships based on charisma alone. It's not gonna get you far in life, I'll tell you that much. But anyway, the B plot is basically Mooney and Shinobu watching from the sidelines and stalking Rinku and Kyoko as they try to figure out what love is, and Shinobu and Mooney kind of putting aside their differences, following these two boneheads around, and then being jelly while doing so. And so that part is a little bit cute. I mean, two cute girls being jelly. How's that not an entertaining story? And so the B plot is what salvages the story from being bumped down to D tier. Aside from that, I don't have much to say about the story. The presentation's fine. Voice acting's good. B plot's actually not bad. White Macaroon's super good. So D tier or C tier you go. Okay. This one's an interesting one to talk about. Time Drifts Lazily. I'll put this one in B tier right now. I remember the joke being made is that, like, people were kind of like, yeah, whatever with the What Is Love? But then Time Drifts Lazily came out after, and people made the joke of, like, Rinku and Kyoko walked so Esra and Rei could run, because this story was actually pretty good. You know what? I'm gonna put an A tier. So the story itself, the reason why I was willing to bump it down to B tier is that the story's okay, but at the same time, there's a clear problem with this story, and I might as well talk about this now. This story is mainly really about Rei. The story is about Rei. Whereas when I was analyzing a lot of the other stories, the story is about both characters mostly. The only other story that's similar, where it's like it's really focused about one character, that would be the Haruna Aoi story, where back with the Haruna Aoi story, the story is really about Aoi, and Haruna pushes the story along. She's the character that is used for the wall climbing, as people would call it. So Aoi wall climbs over Haruna to develop Aoi's character. In the same way, this story, The Time Drifts Lazily, the story is really about Rei. It has very little to do with Esra, but Esra is the one that pushes the story along. Now, the premise of the story is the story actually explores quite a bit about Rei's trauma with her piano playing. And what makes this really cool, and why I think I have to bump it to A tier, because it really, this was a story that had been built up since the beginning of D4DJ. So ever since Rei's introduction episode, which is episode 4 of First Mix, well, technically Rei appears in episode 1, but the real introduction of Rei's character comes out in episode 4. And what you learn is that Rei plays the piano quite a bit, but apparently she kind of stopped playing. But then, of course, joining Happy Around as like the melody person and playing piano for Happy Around kind of re-sparks her interest in music again. But then, of course, there's that little that seed is planted, and you're wondering, well, what happened to Rei? This story explains that in good detail. And so what you learn is that Rei had, Rei, at first she loved playing the piano, but she just had too much pressure from like her mom and her music instructors about like, you're actually very talented in piano, why don't you pursue it professionally? And so that built a lot of pressure into Rei, because trying to pressure any child into any profession, that can get real rough. And in Rei's case, eventually what happened was, when Rei was in middle school, she froze in a piano playing competition. She froze, and ever since then, Rei was kind of traumatized. That's the best way of putting it, because the story itself never uses that word, but that's basically what happened. Rei was traumatized, and so she kind of stopped playing piano professionally in that sense. And so I don't know if this is still too loud. I can never be sure, honestly. I'm gonna turn this down. Sorry, I know it sucks when you have to play, because I did check some of my videos, did playbacks of them, and I realized that sometimes my voice can be hard to hear. I do have the mic right next to me, so maybe I might be too loud now, but anyway, I'm just gonna adjust the music a bit, make it even quieter. But anyway, back to Rei. So this story, it really explores that trauma that Rei has, and then Esra, her function in the story is to kind of break Rei out of that shell, to move past her trauma. Now the interesting thing, at first I thought that the reason why this story had a bit of a weakness is that really you could have explored this concept with almost any character. Esra was not necessary for this. At least I thought that at first. But you could tell, and this is where okay, so if you remember my earlier claim, I made the claim that the Photon Maiden girls, their stories had the most thought put into their stories. I meant that collectively, all the Photon Maiden girls, their group combinations, whatever. There was more thought put into that. But as an individual story, it's between the Rika and Tsubaki story and the Rei and Esra story. Between those two stories, those are the stories that have the most thought as individual stories put into them. Because you could tell the Rei Esra story was a build-up since the beginning of First Mix. And so for it to culminate into this story, they pulled out all the stops with this one. And so that's why I think it has to be an A tier. Not only does it make a good climax to the Rei story arc, and so in a way, outside of doing little adventures with Rei and her socially awkward behavior, aside from little adventures, really Rei's story arc is actually complete, and it was completed in a very good fashion with this story. Once again, you can always create new little adventures with Rei, but this story arc of Rei that had been built up since the beginning of D4DJ, it climaxes here and it does not fail to deliver. So basically what happens is Rei, to go to the story itself, it starts with Rei being confronted with her mother about entering a piano contest. And Rei's like, you know what? I think I can get back into it. I think I got it. I'll do it because you said so, kind of thing. But then, of course, Rei starts having second thoughts about it, and so Esra starts to try and help her out, like to help practice piano with her, and all that. So, at first, Esra thought that like what Rei needs is just practical help, but of course, Rei's trauma goes deeper than that. So, Esra begins to really understand that like what Rei really needs. And what Rei really needed was to be reminded about why she plays piano and to rekindle Rei's love of music and Rei's love of playing the piano. And so what the story utilized, and it is built in since the beginning of Groovy Mix, they introduced the whole like Rei and Esra actually know each other, because the funny thing is that like there's no interaction really between them in first mix, but Groovy Mix there's this whole like they knew each other since they were young. And what you learn is that Esra also used to play the piano, but what we learn is that Esra, she gave up playing the piano because after watching Rei play, Esra realized that she never actually really loved playing the piano. And that Esra's only reason for doing it was just to look cool, basically. To get praises from people and to look cool. But Rei's passion showed Esra that I need to seek out something I'm passionate about. Not just play piano for people's validation. And so Esra kind of reminds Rei about like, I know that you love playing the piano. I know you do it because you have a love for it. So I'm going to help you rekindle that passion, is basically the story. And so, fast forward, because we got to speed this video up. Rei decides to play in this like piano recital thing. And then Rei shows her passion for music by ad-libbing the music a little bit. She kind of does her own thing, which is considered extremely unprofessional when you're doing a piano recital. Because when you do a recital, you're supposed to play the sheet music. You play it to the letter. But Rei decides she's going to do her own flair. She wants to show her style and her love for music. But at the same time, like Rei's like, this is what I live for. This is what it means for me to play music. And so Rei's story climaxes here where it's like, yes, I remember why I love music, and I will keep loving music from here on out, kind of thing. So the story itself, like, especially for the Rei fans out there, this was probably like their favorite story, no doubt. For the climax of Rei's story arc to be played out here, it's really good. It's really good. There's no getting around that. The story itself is pretty good. What easily makes it an A tier and almost an S tier, but I don't know if I can put it in S tier because the story is not as good as, you know, this one. But there's a funny thing about this story that this story had very high production value, very high. A lot of the backdrops, they created a set of new backdrops. They played different music instead of like their typical D4DJ background music tracks. They even played like famous piano pieces like Canon and D major in the background of this story. And of course the animation, top notch. They even used like little anime clips in the story. And there's even a part that I'm surprised they never did this again. I mean, at the same time, there's probably a good reason. But there would be moments where it would have both characters on screen, but as opposed to typical visual novel where you just see like the 2D sprites of both characters on screen as they're talking to each other, the animation it animates them and it makes it look like they're actually talking to each other. Like they're like there'll be a cut where like you see Ezra's face and then you see the back of Ray's head as they talk to each other, and then the thing will reverse and then you'll see the back of Ezra's head and Ray's face as they're talking to each other. And the production value was super high. But then when you look at how high the production value was, it makes you think of like, there's no way they could keep doing this. You couldn't do this for like every story. That would be way too much work. Especially for like a gacha game, right? And secondly, it would probably eat way too much like power on people's phones and their tablets. So Bushiroad probably thought to themselves like, oh, I guess we can't keep doing this. This is not going to work. So they stopped doing it. The only other story that did something remotely similar was the Rondo... Well, no, there's a couple stories. A couple of the Nova side stories used it. The Rondo one did quite a bit. The Lyrical Lily story did it a little bit, and the Happy Around story used it. But then, like, stories after these ones, they stopped using it. Because I think because of, like, it was just too much work, and they didn't want to put that much work into these videos. So, I think they stopped doing it for that reason. Another thing that, once again, like, the production value was super high. I mentioned for quite a few of the other stories, a lot of characters aside from the main characters are not voice acted. But in this one, both Ray's parents are actually like voice acted. So there's which is interesting because like, see, one of the things about the Yuka Ibuki one is that there's only two voice actors, Yuka and Ibuki. In the Ray Esra one, all the Happy Around girls appear in the story. And so they all, there's already them. And then, of course, Ray's parents are also voice acted. To be fair, they did have voice actors in First Mix, which, once again, it brings in that tie-in with the very beginning of D4DJ. And so that's a cool nod to kind of the build-up of this story. Another thing that was kind of neat is the build-up of Esra's character. So, what makes the story work as well, and why it works to have Esra be the one who helps Ray in her trauma, is that before this story, Esra goes through quite a lot of growth, primarily in the Piki Piki Nova story, as well as the relation story between Esra and Shinobu. And Esra goes through a lot of character growth. So this story, which was all about Ray's character growth, using Esra to push the plot, is supposed to show the audience how much Esra has grown. And so if I were to go back to my tier list, I might bump Esra to A tier because of this story. It was just that good. And of course the production value easily makes it like high tier. So it's a tough one. It's really good. It could be an S tier. Even though it's not quite as good as the Rika Tsubaki story, I think it's up there. I think it's up there. I don't know, I just really like it. Alright, next one is the Miko and Nagisa story. It's a tough one. Story's okay. I think it has a reverse problem of this one. These two stories kind of fall in the same camp. But I think the problem is fundamentally a reversed one. So I mentioned with the What is Love story. The problem with that story fundamentally is the premise of the story. The premise sucks. Whereas they wanted to do something neat with this story, with the Nagisa Miko story. I don't remember what it's called. It's the Nano of the Dead. And so the Nano of the Dead is kind of, it's the okay, so this is funny thing. I don't know if I want to, how much of it I want to talk about right now. Well, I mean, I already went into some detail in my Halloween video. And so in my Halloween video, I was talking about the D4DJ music video, Look at Me, where even though the story takes place in the month of June, it had like the whole zombie theme. And the funny thing is, Nano of the Dead also came out in June. Well, see, the funny thing is, like, the All Mix episode, the story takes place in June, but the episode came out in February. Nano of the Dead actually came out in June. And then it was like July for us international server people. And the whole thing is this weird thing that Japanese media just does because it just works. So in June, in Asian cultures, we have something called, in the Chinese world, we call it Hansang. And Hansang is, it translates to by the mountainside or by the hillside or something. And that expression is used as a euphemism for visiting graves. And so the story of Nano of the Dead is a story that takes place in, like, it begins with like a zombie apocalypse. And Miko and Nagisa are trying to survive the zombie apocalypse. However, where the story immediately falls flat on its face, and this is where I have to bump it down to C tier. If it didn't do this stupid move, I think I would have easily put it in the B tier, because I think the story itself, the zombie apocalypse story and how it plays out, the zombie apocalypse parts, if you will, of the story, it would have been a B tier, I think. But because the story immediately shoots itself in the foot, I'm going to have to bump it down to a C tier. So the beginning of the story, which you already know it's ruined at this point. The story opens up with the fact that this is actually a virtual reality. And so what you learn is that Miko's family, who runs like electronics, I guess, because Miko is also like almost comically rich. She would be that super, super rich girl. Not quite as comical as Miu is, but she's up there. And the reason for that is because Miko's family, they like work in electronics. And so they have a virtual reality program that Miko's family's company is running. And the program that they run is the pandemic, which is a nice nod to the real life COVID pandemic, and then turns into a zombie apocalypse, because of course you would, right? So if the story didn't tell us, like, in the I think it's the first or second chapter, if the story didn't open up with the fact that this is a virtual reality, I think the story would have been a lot better. It would have been a good story. I think it could have been a good story, but since they immediately tell you it's virtual reality, then the rest of the story kind of doesn't, like, a lot of the weight of the rest of the story is kind of gone. You don't feel like a lot of the nuance of the later parts of the story kind of fall flat. So the central thesis of the story, just to give you a quick rundown of it, is Nagisa coming to realize that, like, I can't keep acting like a child. I've got to be more mature. And the way that Nagisa comes to this realization is she feels very protective of Miko. And she's like, we're going to make it out of the zombie apocalypse, and I'll protect you no matter what happens. And so that would have worked a lot better if we didn't know from the beginning that this was all fake anyway. So the weight of Nagisa's conviction kind of it loses weight. It it doesn't have that same gravitas, if you will, because you know the whole thing is fake. I mean, of course, the whole thing would have to be fake. D4DJ comes through the end of the world. Right? Where do you go from there? But I think if they had done the whole virtual reality as like the plot twist at the end, I think that would have worked better. But they didn't do that. They just tell us at the beginning that the whole thing is fake. So you don't feel urgency and agency in the story. And that just ruined it. That ruined it for me. So it's not so bad as to fall in the D tier, but it's not a. I think the story itself got ruined pretty badly. So C tier, you go. Because I think yeah, I'm actually considering putting it in D tier now, because even though once again I didn't like I think the story fell flat because of its premise problem, or the bad execution of the premise of the zombie apocalypse premise. The execution of it was kind of poor because they gave it away that it was virtual reality too early. But compared to the next story, I'm gonna tear into this story. I'm gonna tear into this one. I'm gonna just say it now. This is the weakest story by far. It's borderlining bad, actually. Now, the reason why I have to say that, okay, what is my definition of a bad? Why is the story bad? I better defend that position, because even the C tier ones, yeah, they're kind of mid, but there were still things about them I liked. So in the Nano of the Dead, the theme itself, the premise of the story itself was good. How it was executed was kind of poor. Of course, the acting is kind of cute, and Nagisa's character arc in the story is actually a cute one. I do like the whole Nagisa, thinking I have to take responsibility. I gotta learn to be brave. I can't be a kid anymore. I think that was a good story. But this next one, the Hero Dahlia one, I don't know. I was not vibing with this story. It's not that good. And the fundamental flaw with this story, it runs into quite a number of flaws I pointed out in other stories. Which is funny now that I say that, because one of the flaws, I mentioned it in an S tier one, which is why I think I might bump this one back down, actually. Back down you go. Because this story, the Rei Esra one, has a fundamental flaw in it. And it's the same with the Aoi Haruna one. It's the same with the Noah Kurumi one. And it's also kind of true with the Nagisa Miko one. And that's the fact that the story is actually only really about one of the characters. So in this case, the story is really about Hiro. But see, unlike the other stories where with Haruna is used to build the plot. Esra is used to build the plot. And in this case, Miko's there to build the plot, because Nagisa needs someone to pretend to be an older sister too. So Miko is there to build the plot. Dahlia doesn't really do that. Dahlia's existence in the story is to allow the setting of the story to occur. Let me explain. So the story is actually about Hiro's estranged past. And what we learn is that Hiro did not talk to her mother a lot. Her and her mother had a very distant relationship as Hiro was growing up. And so what happens is the bulk of this story is actually a flashback, which is already minus points. So a lot of the stories basically treated like a flashback. And this is where, compared to the other stories, all the other stories, even when some stories explore origin stories, so this is an origin story to some extent. This one is an origin story, or it gives an origin story. This one, okay, let me put it this way. Even though the Noah Kurumi one and the Rei Esra stories a big part of their story is the origin story of how these characters know each other. But at the same time, that origin story is used to push like future plots. So Rey's climax as a character and her moving past her trauma, and Noah's conviction and her love of cute things and how she's going to keep being a freak, basically. But that doesn't really happen in the story. See, what happens in the story is a certain customer comes into the store that Dahlia works at. And that character is actually Hiro's mom. And so Dahlia builds a rapport with Hiro's mom. And so Dahlia learns a lot about Hiro, that Hiro is not willing to open up with other people. So once again, the story is really about Hiro and how Hiro has this kind of... Hiro's Dami Mommy personality comes out of like her lack of her mother figure, because she didn't know her mom all that well. They don't talk. So subconsciously, Hiro came up with this Dami Mommy personality to be a mother figure to other people where her mother failed to be one. Dahlia only links... Dahlia's whole purpose in the story is just to link those two ideas. The idea of Hiro's Dami Mommy and her abandonment issues. Or not abandonment issues, but her estranged relationship with her mother, more accurately. And so Dahlia is just kind of like the middleman, if you will, of the story. That's all she does. She's not really particularly used to advance the plot. Dahlia is basically a surrogate for the audience to learn about Hiro. That's the entirety of the story. And what makes it worse is that the whole story takes place as a flashback. And so in a timeline wise, but of course D4DJ, the problem with trying to make up any timeline is that the game's been out for 3 years, but nobody ages. So it's hard to put this in like a timeline. But basically, if you were to put this story in a timeline, the flashback takes place at like the very earliest days of Groovy Mix. That's kind of how you have to think about it. Where Hiro and Dahlia are not close friends, really. But Dahlia learns a lot about Hiro. A lot of things that a lot of the other characters don't actually know, even up to today. And once again, Dahlia really serves as a surrogate for the audience to learn this about Hiro. And that's that, you know, Hiro has mommy issues, basically. That's the story. And then what you learn in the story, part of the flashback, is that Dahlia had a little bit of rapport with Hiro's mom, and that's where she learns a lot about Hiro. And then the end of the story it jumps to the present day. So I was like, wait, the whole thing was a flashback this whole time? And then Dahlia just constantly, like, she sees Hiro's mom again, and then they just have a little chat, just say like, how you've been. Have you worked out things with your daughter yet? And the mom's still like, well, I'm not totally sure, you know, how to, you know, I still struggle with how to approach my daughter, kind of thing. A year later? Are you for real? Like, quote unquote, a year later, right? Because remember, time flow in this game is kind of weird, right? So it's like, a year has passed, and, you know, I'm trying to get close to my daughter, but, you know, it's not easy. And it's like, what? Nothing happened? Like, that's a weak ass story. And especially when I'm like comparing this to like the last story, to this story, where like with Rey and Ezra's story, a lot happens. In this story, nothing happens. And so it's a bad story. It's a bad story because of that. Like, you basically just wasted my time. Alright, it's almost 6 o'clock. Let's just blaze through the last one and then do an overarching discourse on all the stories. I know this sounds like I know I'm gonna be viewed as a massive hypocrite here. Oh, that's awkward. How do I fix that? Nope, no. There. Now you get to see Tier Maker, but get rid of that save or download thing. Okay, so the last story is Mooney and Shinobu, and I'm putting the beats here. Now I know some people are gonna immediately think this whole tier list is BS now, because I know a lot of people would probably put this one lower, And the reason why a lot of people would put this one lower is because, as I mentioned before, the earlier stories, a lot of people would. I mean, I made the argument that a lot more thought was put into these stories compared to some of the later ones, like especially these ones. Like 3 later stories, all like bottom tier. And the same complaint goes here that did for like these stories. It's funny how they all lined up here together as well, so it's easy to point at them. But it like you could tell Bushiroad didn't put as much thought in these stories because the combination was weak. We had 3 stories that were happy around and peaky peaky, and I felt like that was kind of weak compared to like Lyrical Lily. There was Lyrical Lily Rondo, Lyrical Lily Photon Maiden, well, 2 with Rondo, and then what was the other one? One with Mermaid, and then Photon Maiden had a lot of diversity. And so that for 3 cross-unit relation stories to be peaky peaky and happy around, you could tell like they did not think this part through. They probably like did this part, painted themselves into a corner, like, oh crap, what do we do, right? And so the Mooney and Shinobu one kind of like just culminates that like problem, if you will. However, despite this problem, I still think the story itself is kind of cute. Well, first of all, you put 2 really cute girls together. So similar to like putting 2 S-tier girls together, you're going to get a decent story. Well, in this case, you're going to get a good story. Here, you're going to get a pretty decent one. And so the story premise, I might as well talk about the story's premise. There's two plots going on. One about each girl. So Shinobu is asked by her older brother to write and perform a song at his wedding. And Shinobu agrees to do it. And then Mooney is thinking about going to art school after she graduates from Yoba. Because when you're late in your second year, and you move into your 3rd year of high school, you're supposed to do like all the whole career decision, or what are you going to do after high school kind of thing. And so this is where like the timeline thing gets weird, and I don't know, maybe they'll do something neat with volume 4 when we get there, that maybe characters will actually age and will move up 1 year after 3 years of the game. But basically Mooney's thinking about like second year is ending, you gotta do the whole career planning, what are you gonna do after high school thing. And so Mooney's thinking about going to art school. And so even though they've kind of had these like, these are the main plots, they themselves are kind of unsure. So Shinobu's unsure about how she should write a song for her brother's wedding, and Mooney's unsure about how she should go about applying for art school, even if she even should. And so I'm just gonna move this thing a little bit more. Just so Miko's face can be in the picture on frame. But anyway, what happens is kind of a whole meta joke. The whole story is basically a meta joke at this point. So what you learn is that, well, what you should have known from the very beginning is that Mooney and Shinobu are like gamer girls, which is probably why so many people like them, why they're both A tiers for me. Is that they're like cute gamer girls. That's like one of the best things ever, right? So they're 2 cute gamer girls and they're playing like online games. And they have like voice chat in the games that they play. And they end up talking to each other. Which, unbeknownst to them, they don't actually know that they're talking to each other. Because in real life, Mooney and Shinobu like butt heads a lot. Because they both have too much pride, if you will. And so it's basically the question of who backs down first, but neither of them are going to do it. And so they butt heads a lot. But in this online game that they're playing, and they like voice chat with each other, which is funny that they don't recognize each other's voices. But maybe you can play the whole race card and just say Japanese cute girls all sound the same. Even though clearly they don't. But they don't, for some stupid reason, they don't recognize each other. And so the whole thing, you watch them interact with each other, And it's like a whole meta joke that dramatic irony. So for those of you who don't know what dramatic irony is, it's a plot device used in theater where, of course, it translates to all kinds of like stories, but in theater typically it's when the audience is given information that the characters may not yet know. So the popular example of this is in Romeo and Juliet, which is funny I referenced that play in particular. If you know how the story of Romeo and Juliet, what happens is Juliet comes up with a plan to try and run away with Romeo because, of course, she's not allowed to marry him because they're part of rival families. And so Juliet comes up with this plan that she's going to fake her death, and then later, after everybody thinks she's dead, she's going to run away with Romeo. But the funny thing, she doesn't tell Romeo this plan, which is what ends up leading to the tragedy. And of course, the ending of the play is we, the audience, watch the tragedy play out, we know that this can't go well because the characters don't know what we know, and so we expect the characters are going to mess up big, which is exactly what happens. Romeo thinks that she's dead, and so he kills himself, thinking that Juliet's really dead. But the audience knows that Juliet isn't dead. But then you're just like, oh crap, when like Romeo kills himself because he's an idiot, right? So, and then of course Juliet wakes up and then she sees that Romeo's dead and she's all heartbroken that he's dead, so she kills herself. And so they both die. And so there's the whole joke about like, what if Romeo just waited a few minutes for Juliet to wake up and then everything would have been fine? But that's where the dramatic irony plays in, that we, the audience, know what's really going on, where the characters don't. And so going back with Mooney and Shinobu, that's kind of what happens. We know that Mooney and Shinobu are talking to each other, but they don't actually know that they're talking to each other. But what's funny is what makes it funny is that they feel relaxed around each other. And they actually give each other practical advice. So Mooney is giving helpful advice about how to find inspiration on how to write a wedding song for her brother. And then Shinobu gives practical advice of, well, how much are you passionate about your art and being an artist? Do you have other plans? Do you have a plan B in case it doesn't pan out? And so they give actually really helpful advice to each other, but they don't actually know that they're talking to each other. And then, of course, the story plays out that Shinobu does come up with the song, and her brother's really happy about it. And then Mooney decides that she's not going to pursue art school right away. One, because there's the whole thing with like her mom and her. Mooney wants to be more considerate of her mother, because there's a story that played out before this where it was a summer festival story, and Mooney's mother, like, she faints one day at work, and then Mooney feels all guilty, and Mooney feels all bad about how she felt guilty for her mom overexerting herself. So Mooney is a much more mindful and grateful person, which is why I rated Mooney as an A tier, because of that story. And I was just like, oh, like, I really came to love Mooney's character when she became a lot more considerate of others. Go figure. And so Mooney decides to be considerate of her mother and being a good daughter kind of thing. And so she's like, I'm going to delay going to art school, but I'm going to keep working hard for Happy Around, and then I'm going to go get a real job. So that might be a fun arc to explore in Volume 4 of Groovy Mix, is Mooney getting a job. So that might be an interesting. I would like to see that story play out. I mean, it's definitely a better story arc than Mooney and Rinku's relationship. I think their love story kind of sucks, to be honest. Not just because I'm a passer who's against the whole girl-on-girl action thing. That's not the actual reason. I just think the story itself sucks. But a fun story arc would be Mooney getting a real job. But because of like that whole like the dramatic irony is funny for starters. Because of course when you get to the end of the story, the very end of the story, Mooney and Shinobu, they like, they meet again at school and then they're like talking mad crap to each other and getting on each other's case. Because they always butt heads, right? Because they're both arrogant teenage girls that don't know when to back down. And then there's this funny part where like Mooney wishes Shinobu was like that girl online, and Shinobu wishes that Mooney was like that other girl online, unbeknownst to them that it is them. And so, haha, dramatic irony meta joke. I think the story itself is quite... the reason why I put it in B tier is that, one, the comedy between that is pretty funny. And secondly, when you get to see the more, like, serious... Like, basically when Shinobu and Mooney are being nice, and actually they're not just being, like, prideful teenage girls, and that cute side of them comes out. So now Mooney and Shinobu being cute on a meta level, aside from Noah just freaking out about their appearance all the time. On a meta level, they're super cute. And that's why they're A tiers for me. Even though I made that tier list before the story came out. But, I mean, case in point now. But I think the story, it was handled very well. And I think for a last story, I think they did a good job with the final story. For these cross-unit relation stories, which unfortunately now we're not going to get any for a long time, because now we have to do like in-unit relation stories 16 times. Wait, sorry, trying to do this math in my head. 16 times? Wow. Yeah, we got to do it 16 times because now we have Abyssmare and Unicorn to include, and I'm praying that like this game lasts for that long, that maybe we'll get future cross-unit stories. Of course, that won't happen. If that does ever happen, it won't be for like 2 years almost, because it'll just take that long to get there. But to see what other future stories could play out. But overall, this is my tier list. One story that stands out above the rest, the best story. One of the best stories in the entire game, so that's why it gets to be S tier. Other really good stories, setting the bar real high here, because only like, if I was like for a first story, this one set the bar high. The only stories I would say are better than this one is like this one, maybe this one, because this one was kind of really cute to read and to revisit. When I was rereading the stories before today's stream. This one was really cute to revisit. I really like this one. But it's not as good as these other ones. I think this one's really good. But I don't think this one is better than this one. I think the Sari Miyu is like third best. Which is, I guess, I don't know how to view that. Whether that's like a good thing or a bad thing. Because that means like your third best story was the very first story you presented. But, I mean, okay, this story is the best story. So, easy S tier. And then these ones... See, these two are kind of mid. These ones were kind of, like... These ones had clear problems. Because their premise... This one had a bad premise. This one had a spoiled execution. That's what I'm going to go with. This one had a spoiled execution. This one had a bad premise. And then these two were just kind of mid. These three, I found the stories overall to be pretty good. They're not as good as these ones, but I found them to be good in general. Like, I like them. And it's not like I okay, let me put it this way. These ones, it's not like I flat out dislike them, but when I compare them to the other stories, these ones were clearly lacking, which is why I put them down to a C tier. And finally, the D tier, it's the one story I didn't like. Because I felt like they were just so lazy and sloppy with this one. There was so much they could have done with Hiro and Dahlia, and they just didn't do it. Instead, you get a crappy flashback story that really is only about one character. And the other character is basically fridged. So, yeah, that's my tier list. I'm looking forward to the new volume of Groovy Mix, if I didn't say that enough times already. And seeing how like different bands interact. Because like, for instance, I already said this before, like, okay, so like, the funny thing is that like, the Rondo Mermaid one, I mean, we already had good stories where they mix. Well, we had one good story, one bad story. Kind of weird. But we'll see how, what other story you could tell with the two groups working together again. Because I feel like, I mean, Groovy Mix could keep doing that because Tsubaki and Rika just work so well. I mean, for all intents and purposes, they're the main characters of Groovy Mix. So I'm sure you can come up with something. But I am looking for, like, okay, so the Abyss Mare Unicorn one, I just look forward to it because Neo and Lumina. How's that not going to be good? Because really, the story would be about them anyway. You don't find as much interact. I mean, yeah, they kind of built up the whole, like, Elsie and Veronica being a cute ship because the official lesbian couple makes fun of them about being like a couple. Well, more Hayate, because Hayate is badass, right? But we'll see how. Maybe they'll do something with that in that story. I'm just putting like minor predictions as we end the video. And then what's interesting is going to be, well, the one that's kind of out there that we don't really know how to play out, but we'll see, is, Happy Around and Lyrical Lily. Because I don't know what kind of story they'll come up to make those two groups cross beat, if you will. Of course, Piki Piki and Photon Maiden, that one's kind of obvious. It's going to be a continuation of the Volume 3 Nova stories of Piki Piki and Photon Maiden. It's obviously going to be a continuation, so I'm excited to see it. But with these stories, some bangers, some not as much, and one bad story. Bushy Road they've done a good enough job prepping themselves for larger crossover stories. So I'm excited to see how the new crossovers will perform. I am looking forward to that. So yeah, it took me 3 hours to tier 12 stories, but I mean, when you gotta talk about 12 whole ass stories, you knew it was gonna take a while. But with that said, this is gonna be the end of the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed more D4DJ content and tier listing. I'll be back on Monday with a new game project, so definitely check that out. If you like this video and any other D4DJ content, don't forget to check out my other D4DJ videos, which I have put links in the description. And if you want to see more D4DJ, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe. And I got more D4DJ content down the hatch as well, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Since you can tell I love this franchise quite a bit. So I will see you guys on Monday at 2 o'clock Pacific time for our next project. Until then, I hope you guys have a great Friday night. I hope you guys have a great weekend. And I'll see you guys next week. God bless you. Good night.